Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are back with the third and final day of the FIDE World Rapid Chess Championship being held in Doha, Qatar. Now, going into the final day, we had a two-way tie between the leaders, Vladislav Artemiev from Russia and Hans Niemann from the United States. Trailing half a point behind were the five-time world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, as well as the reigning world champion Gukesh Domaraju. So we're going into this final day a lot on the line. Now in the 10th round, the first round of the day, Artemiev and Niemann would draw. Magnus would get a big win with the white pieces against the Russian Grandmaster Alexei Sarana, and this sets up the El Clasico of the modern day between Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen. Now, due to the tiebreakers and the situation with points, Magnus gets a double white with a three-way tie at the top. This game promises to be very hype. So let's jump right into the action. So we have Magnus with the white pieces against Hans. The game starts with e4. We get e5, knight to f3, knight c6. And now Magnus goes for the classic Gucci piano with bishop to c4. We get knight f6, d3, bishop to c5, and now we get castles, and the move h3. Now, one of the things that's really great about this Gucci piano opening at the top level is that all the pieces stay on the board. No pieces get traded very early, which means you get a long fight and there's no simplification. So we get the move d6 from Hans. Magnus plays c3, a5, rook e1, bishop a7, and now we get the move knight e2. Hans plays knight e7, knight f1, knight g6, bishop b3, and now we get the move c6. Magnus plays d4 here, and this is the first moment where we start to see the players think. Now, in this position, white could play knight g3 as well, but d4 really is going for the aggressive route here. White tries to create play in the center immediately and asks black what black will do about the big white center. Sort of on the contrary side, if black is able to get the pawn to d5 before white gets d4, generally this is considered to be good for black. So one of the things about the Gucci piano is it really comes down to who can claim the center immediately. So after d4, Hans plays the move d5 after a fairly long think, and now Magnus plays the move bishop g5 after using 2.5 minutes. Now I suspect here Magnus was thinking about the different options in this position, and bishop g5 is the most concrete reply. White could try to play a move like knight g3, but after takes here, takes, for example, and bishop to f5, this is simply a very boring position. We have even material. Both sides have some pawns in the center. Let's say we get takes and bishop f4, and the game is very likely to end peacefully in a draw. Now, Magnus on a double white here really wants to try and win the game, so he plays the move bishop to g5, and here Hans plays h6. We get the trade, take on d5, take on d4, and now in this position Hans plays a very peculiar move, knight to f4. Now this move is a mistake from Hans objectively, but I actually like this decision because what Hans is doing here is he's trying to argue that in this position, even though he's down a pawn here on the queen side, white has this extra pawn on b2, black has the two b's as well as this very nice knight on f4. Now, the famous former world champion, Garry Kasparov, said many times that a knight on f4, f5 is worth at least a pawn. Unfortunately, in this case, that is actually inaccurate. And the main reason is that black has this weak pawn on c6, and black also doesn't really have access on this diagonal. The pawn cuts off the bishop. There aren't any good sacks here. So even though it looks very good with the two bishops and the knight, in reality, white is much better. So we get bishop to e6. Magnus plays knight to e4, we get queen d8, and now we get the move rook c1, we get the trade, and here we get the move rook b8. Magnus plays queen e3, we get knight to e6, and now Magnus plays this move b3. Now, from a computer standpoint, this move is a serious mistake for Magnus, but this really shows why Magnus is such a great player, because even if this move is objectively not the best decision here, what happens is we end up in a classic situation where even though the material is going to be even, white is a little bit better and has no risk of losing the game. So we got the move a4. Now this move is a mistake. What Hans should have played is taken on d4, but after rook d1, you have to play rook b4, which is a very tough move to find here. If you play knight takes f3, takes on something like queen to e8 here, for example, white can go knight to d6, and after queen e6, apparently after this very weird move rook c2, white is better. But the main issue here is that if white plays a move like rook to c6 as well, black is down a pawn and you don't have anything concrete. So even though the computer would prefer a move like rook takes c6 right away, followed by I think rook to d6 here, or for example rook takes b2 in this very awkward move knight d6, this is not easy to spot in a blitz or rapid game. In a classical game you can spend 10-15 minutes, but Magnus understands that eliminating the risk and having a one-way game where only he can win or it's a draw with perfect play is perfect for the situation. So after b3, Hans decides to play the move a4. Magnus takes on c6. We get the Knight takes d4, rook d6, takes, queen a5, and now we get the move rook d1. Hans trades on b3, and now he plays the move rook b e8. Now the computer here thinks this position is defensible, but again, black is down one extra pawn here. White has a very, very safe king in an endgame, so there's zero risk and everything to play for in terms of grinding down an endgame victory for Magnus. So we get rook to d7. Hans plays bishop b8, Magnus goes g3 here, a nice move, creating space for the king so that there will be no ice skater checkmates, and now we get the move queen to e5. Magnus plays knight d6, we get the trade, and now we've reached another endgame where Magnus is up a pawn on the b file. Objectively, this should be a draw with correct play, but when we look at the time situation, Magnus up 2 minutes, extra pawn on the board, and Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, this is going to be pure misery for Hans Niemann. Now here Hans plays the move rook to b8. This is a very logical move to pressure the pawn, but it probably would have been more practical to play a move like queen to e2, trying to trade the queens off immediately. We get rook b8 instead, king g2, and now Hans plays the move rook b4, and this is a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that Hans is desperate to trade the queens in this position, but he has wasted time here. He's played rook b8 and rook b4, wasting 2 tempi, and now, as we're about to see, it's just too little too late. We get rook to d8, queen to e4, we get the trade, king to f3, rook b4, takes, and after rook to d3, this is simply a concrete winning rook and pawn endgame for Magnus here. The biggest reason why this is winning is because this king is cut off here. If black were able to get this king all the way over to, say, the b file, let me just set this up somehow. Say you got something like this with the king in front of this pawn, this would probably be a draw under the right circumstance. Now, of course, I can tell that based on the valuation, this specific position is winning, but if the king is in front of the pawn, there are always good chances to save the game. But here, the king cannot cross this d file. This rook both guards the pawn, but it shields the king from being able to cross. So with the rook cutting off the king, white can bring the king around, start pushing the p, and this is simply GG, why not? So we get king to e3. Hans plays f5, king d2, rook b8, and now we get to move king c3. In this position, Hans plays check, we get king b2, rook b8, and now Magnus plays the move rook d4, trying to escort the pawn up the board while keeping this king completely cut off. So we get king to e6, b4, g5, and now we get to move king c3. Hans plays h5, Magnus plays h4, and this move looked a little bit awkward to me at the time when I was watching the game live, but in reality it's a very, very nice move because after g4 here and the move king c4, white intends to plant this rook on f4. The pawns guard each other and the rook, and this means the king and the pawn simply rush up the board, and it's just GG without any counterplay. So we get king e5, rook to f4, pawns all guard each other here, so this side of the board is completely frozen, meaning that it's simply a matter of using the king and the pawn to go up the board, push the p, and win the game. Hans checks, we get king b5, rook c3, king b6, rook c1, b5, and now Magnus simply keeps moving the king up the board with the pawn. We get king c7, b7, king e6, and now Magnus plays king c7, and here Magnus intends to build the classic bridge formation, which we usually see with a rook and pawn versus rook. We get rook c2, king b6, rook b2, king c6, and here Hans resigns because basically if he checks again, white goes king b5 here, you have to check, and there's rook b4 building the bridge here. The pawn is free to queen on the next turn, white gets the queen, and it's all but over. If you play a move like rook to b1 to wait, white will simply go rook to a4. If you check, it's the same thing, I build the bridge, and if you play a move like rook b2, now white can play rook to a8 here, or rook to a5, rook b5 as well. Both moves are simply winning here, and black will lose the game. So Magnus gets a very, very big win in the 11th round of the tournament. This means that he is now in the sole lead with 9 points out of 11. And now we're going to jump to a game featuring 2 players who are a half point behind. Now, in the same 11th round, we have Yegiz Khan Erdogmus from Turkey against Arjun Erigaisi, the world number 5 player. But in this game, let's see if Yegiz, the rising 14-year-old super talent, can bring home the dough. So here we get e4. Arjun plays c5, going for the classic Sicilian. We get knight f3, e6, and now we get to move g3. Arjun plays knight c6, bishop g2. We get knight f6, d3, d6, and now the move castles. Bishop to e7, c4 is played here. And this is a move that is an interesting setup by Erdogmus. He's trying to bring the knight out and maybe push d4 on the next turn. The pawn on c4 also potentially tries to control more space in the center and prevent black from playing pawn to d5. So we got castles, knight c3, and now Arjun plays the move rook b8. We got d4 here, and Arjun plays e5. Now we get the trade, and at this point we've reached a situation with a very clogged toilet in the middle of the board. Both sides intend to put a knight on the center square. Very, very clogged with pawns on these same two squares in front of each other. It's looking very, very dry. So we got the trade, bishop to e3, b6, h3, rook to e8, king h2, and now we got to move knight d4. Erdogmus plays rook c1, bishop b7, and now we get to move knight d2 to overprotect this pawn on e4. Arjun plays h6, and now we get to move rook to e1, knight d7, and here we get to move knight d5. Now at this point, both sides have a nice bastion. Both sides have a knight that's guarded in the center of the board here, but as you can tell from the valuation, white is a little bit better potentially. So Arjun plays bishop c6, and I want to think that in this game with Arjun, he has a big time advantage here. He's up 5 minutes on the clock, so he's feeling like he's playing somebody who's weaker. He's playing a kid who's 14. He's up on the clock. He has to try to win. Computer actually wants black to be very, very rock solid with a5, and after something like a4 and b3, we have a really, really clogged toilet. We've got so many closed files in this game. It should be a draw. But Arjun goes bishop c6. We get b3, and now we get to move a6. Erdogmus plays h4 here, trying to maybe go bishop h3 to tickle the knight. And now Arjun plays b5. Here we get bishop to h3, and now we get bishop to a5, and Erdogmus plays king g2. Arjun decides to take, we get rook takes, and now we get to move pawn to f5. Now this move in and of itself is not a huge error in terms of deciding the outcome of the game, but it is the start of going in the wrong direction. Computer would have preferred trading on d5, playing knight to b6, and then this move bishop to b4, hitting the rook here. And if the rook moves away, for example, to e1 after knight takes d5, look at these knights in the center of the board here. If white plays bishop takes pawn after takes, rook to c6, now black can take, and probably this position should be a draw. But Arjun plays f5 here, trying to undermine this knight on d5, and now we get to move rook to d1. Now, it's worth pointing out that even though Erdogmus is low on time, rook to d1 is the absolute best move, and now we get to move bishop b5. Now, this move is a blunder, after which Arjun is in serious trouble here because of bishop takes knight, we get takes, and now the move bishop takes f5. Now, what's amazing about these moves from Erdogmus, let alone how old he is that he's playing these moves with limited time on the clock, and he's playing one of the greatest players on the planet. So we get bishop takes knight. We get takes, and here the dust is settled somewhat. White has one extra pawn in this position, 5 versus 4, and it's looking like Erdogmus is going to get the win. So we get rook d8, knight f4, bishop to b5, and now we get to move a4, bishop e8, and here we have the move rook to c7, trying to set up the classic kebab on the 7th rank and go after this pawn on g7. Here we get bishop f7, b4, rook to e1, and now we get to move pawn to h5. Now you will notice these moves are not precise from either side, but at this point in the game with the players being so low and having to react every 10 seconds, you can't really fault them for any of these moves. So now we get rook to b1. Here Erdogmus plays rook to e2, trying to set up the classic double stack as well as the double kebab on the 7th rank, and now we get to move pawn to d3. Now this move loses the game here. Computer says after rook to e8, black is still very much in the game. White has to play something like rook c2 and then rook c6 maybe. If rook d7, apparently there's bishop c4 to cut off this double connection on the 7th rank. Again, very tough to find, but Arjun instead blunders away the game with d3. We get rook to e7 here, and now if black plays d2, white can simply take the juicer on f7. If black makes a queen after takes, there's checkmate in 1. If you go this way, there's check, and then checkmate or checkmate as well. And if black tries to play rook to g1 here, white can simply take the rook, and after queen, and then move king to g2 here. Black is still under massive threat here on g7. If you go queen to a1, trying to guard after takes, there's knight to e6, forking the king and the rook, and once white takes the rook, white, of course, will win the game. So Arjun tries to play rook f8, but now we get rook to d7, stopping this pawn. Arjun takes, and after knight to g6 here, this is simply power overwhelming. The 2 rooks on the 7th are way too strong here. The bishop, the rook, everything is hanging here. We get bishop takes knight, we get takes, and with the double connection, this pawn here, this is game over. Arjun plays king h8, we get takes, rook c8, check. Now we get rook takes h6, rook c6, and here Erdogmus plays rook d3, we get king g7, and now we get the excellent move rook to h4, liquidating it into an endgame where white is going to have 2 extra pawns. Arjun trades, plays king takes pawn, we get rook to d5 here, and now we get king f7. If Arjun were to play rook c4, white can simply go check, king to h5 takes, and after king h4 here, white can simply move the rook up the board, and after a6, a7, king g7, White will push this pawn. If the king ever moves, you have rook h8 and rook to h7 here. And after rook a3, eventually white is going to be able to push the pawn forward. You take, there's rook to f8 check, you queen the pawn, you win the game. And if white tries to slide over, you have this one. If white goes this way, you have rook h8, and everything leads to Rome. So we get king f7. Erdogmus plays h5, king g7, rook a5, king g3. We got king g4, king g5, f4, rook d5, rook c4, and now we get to move a5. The rook guards the pawn. White has 2p here that you're just pushing freely here. The game is going to end in a white victory. Arjun plays king f7, h6, rook c1, rook d6, check, f5, takes, and now we get to move rook d7, king to e8, and here Erdogmus plays rook to a7, and at this point Arjun resigns, because if you go king to f8 after h7, both this square is covered by the pawn and this square is covered by the rook, so white will push the pawn, get a queen, and it'll be checkmate. If you play rook to a1 after h7, rook to a1, white checks the king, you promote, after takes, white has one extra rook, and white wins the game. So, a marvelous victory for Erdogmus, who's all of 14 years old. This means that as we go into the 12th round, the second to last round here, we have Magnus leading with 9 points out of 11, and we have Erdogmus a half point behind with 8.5. So this means that as we head into the penultimate round, we of course have Erdogmus with the white pieces playing against Magnus Carlsen. Maybe a battle of the generations with Erdogmus being 14. His star and his future are very, very bright. So let's see what Erdogmus can do. So we get e4. Magnus decides to be solid. We get knight c6, and now we have the move bishop b5 with the classic Ruy Lopez defense. Here we get a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, and now we get the move rook e1. Magnus plays b5, and here he decides to castle, and we get the move c3. Now, Magnus decides to play the move d6. In some of his recent World Championship matches, he's played this move d5, which of course is the classic Marshall Gambit. But in this situation, it's very clear that Magnus wants to play something that's solid, much slower, and try to outplay his young opponent. So we get d6. Now we get h3, and Magnus decides to play the move knight b8, and this is what is known as the classic Breyer variation. Black wants to put the knight on d7 to support this pawn on e5, fianchetto the bishop to b7 to pressure the pawn in the center. We get d4, knight e7, knight e2, bishop b7, and now we get this move bishop to c2. After bishop c2, Magnus plays rook e8, we get knight to f1, bishop to f8, and now we get the move knight g3. White is trying to overprotect this pawn on e4, whereas black is trying to set up this big attack on the pawn. So here we got the move a5, and this move is considered to be a little bit dubious here. I believe the main line is to play g6, going for a potential double fianchetto. You can also maybe play c5, d5, c4 as well, but Magnus decides to play the move a5. We got bishop d3, targeting the pawn. We got b4, and now we get the move bishop d2. Magnus plays c6, we get to move knight to f5, and here Magnus trades the pawns on c3. Now what's worth noting here is that Magnus has played very quickly thus far, but as I mentioned during my live commentary, it was clear to me that because Magnus is playing so much younger than him, he wants to avoid a tactical game. He wants something that's more positional, very slow, because the one thing where kids really excel at is tactics. So that's probably the reason Magnus rejected this best variation by taking and playing c5, because after d5, c4, bishop c2, and knight c5, bishop g5, white has this knight near the black king. You also have this bishop targeting the knight and the queen. And at this point, black is apparently better, but it looks very, very scary. So Magnus takes on c3. We got pawn takes, bishop to a6 here. Very nice move from Magnus, trying to exchange his bishop that's behind the pawn and not super active. So we get the trade here. This is a move that I didn't particularly like when I saw it on the board. To me, this was a sign that Erdogmus was trying to be a little bit too solid against Magnus, trying too hard to be solid and make a draw. So we get queen c2 here. Magnus plays queen c7. We get rook b1, and now we get to move rook to b6. Here, Erdogmus takes on e5, and this is the start of falling prey to the classic Magnus effect. I would have preferred the move knight to g3 here, retreating the knight and overprotecting this pawn on e4, because in this position here, there's a lot of tension in the center of the board. We've got the big white center, but this bishop on f8 is also very passive, whereas once you trade, now the diagonal is open, and the bishop can become very active. Also, you have knight c5 here to potentially overload the pressure on the central pawn. So I would have preferred knight g3 here. I think that Erdogmus was probably feeling some pressure. He's playing Magnus, of course, who doesn't feel pressure when you're playing Magnus, but also at this point in the tournament, he has a chance to potentially win if he can win this game. So he decides to trade the pawns, and now he plays move c4. And when I saw this move live at the time, this move is a very, very severe positional error. I'm not really sure what Erdogmus saw when he played this move here. Perhaps he didn't realize the power of a knight coming to c5. But the problem, as we're about to see, as Magnus will ruthlessly exploit, is that when you go c4 here, there are going to be too many problems on these dark squares. And this pawn on e4 specifically is going to become a very, very big target. Now, it's hard for me to explain as a top player why this is so bad. When I saw it, I knew instantly it was a terrible move positionally. I would have preferred a move like bishop to e3 here, targeting the rook. And after bishop c5, for example, trying to maybe play something like rook to d1 here and keep the game going. It's very, very weird because there is rook b8 here potentially. But this would have made a little bit more sense to me to play bishop to e3. Instead, we got c4. Magnus trades. He goes knight c5. And at this point, I already knew that Magnus Carlsen was going to win this game with these knights targeting the pawn in the center. We got knight g3. Magnus plays knight d7, bishop e3. And now we get this move g6, which creates space for the king potentially while stopping the knight from jumping forward. So here we got knight to f1. Magnus plays knight to e6. And now we get the move knight 1 to d2. Magnus plays bishop c5. We got the trade, knight b3, and now we get the move f6, and Magnus here is reinforcing the central pawn. Now what you'll notice here is that after the trade of the knights, this pawn is very solid, meaning the knight really doesn't have good squares, and this knight on c5 is targeting this pawn permanently, and black can try to play on either the d or the b file with the rook and the queen. So we get knight to d2. Magnus plays a4, another excellent positional move, because what Erdogmus would like to do is play knight b3 and challenge this great knight on c5. But Magnus goes to a4. Now you can't challenge the knight. We get knight to f1, and Magnus plays rook to d8. Now, basically, the reason black is so much better is that this knight is pressuring this pawn permanently, and black is going to eventually infiltrate on the d file. We get knight to e3, king g7, and now we get the move queen c1. Now, to make matters worse, on top of having a serious position that's much worse from a positional standpoint, Erdogmus is also very low on time, and it's just very, very hard to play. Computer wants something very unnatural like f3, rook d3, and a strange move king to h2, because if you take, there's queen to f2, hitting the rook and the knight, and basically if you get this knight, you're fine. But this is very, very hard to play, and frankly, if you play a move like queen f2 here after knight e6, with queen d7, knight f4, all these threats on the open file, Magnus is probably going to win. I would also add, if I had this position against Magnus with the white pieces here, I think I would probably lose as well. So this is not anything against Erdogmus. It's just impossible to play such positions against Magnus. So we get queen to c1. This is the move that I think Erdogmus plays because he's trying to go for counterplay. We get takes, and now the move c5. Now here, white is down a pawn, but with some threats of maybe using the b file, maybe there's a glimmer of hope. Now, Magnus plays move h5, and this is actually a very, very serious error. Computer wanted to move rook to d4 right away. It stops white from playing rook b4, which, as we'll see, was the last chance to save the game, because here Erdogmus plays rook b6, but if he were to find rook to b4, after rook to d4, white can play queen b2 here, hitting the rook twice with the queen and the rook, and white is threatening rook b7, so say you play rook d3. After rook b7, it's spaghetti-o time. You'll lose the queen and the game. If black were to play rook to d2 here, for example, white goes queen c1. Now the rook and the knight are under pressure, so white will force a repetition. And if you play knight takes pawn, which is a move after takes, black is up a pawn here after queen to e5. But with the weakness of the knight and the pawn and the potential checks down the road towards the king, computer says this is completely equal. But Erdogmus misses this opportunity. He plays rook to b6. Now Magnus, of course, plays rook to d4. This rook is very nicely centralized. The pawn guards the rook guards the pawn and the knight, and black prepares to double stack on the file. Erdogmus plays rook a6. We get queen b7, rook b6, and now Magnus plays queen d7 with the double stack. Erdogmus plays queen b2. Magnus goes rook d2. We got queen b4, and here we get the coup de grace with queen to d4 here. This move is going to force some kind of trade. The pawn on f2 is weak. The pawn on a2 is weak. Queens are coming off the board. There's just no hope any longer. So Erdogmus plays check. We get king h6. We get queen to c4, and now Magnus decides to trade the queens. This might not be the correct way for a computer to win. You can win in quicker in less moves, but once you trade and you take the pawn on a2 here, weak pawn on f2, weak pawn on c5, you're already up one pawn on the queen side. You of course have the classic bathtub formation here. So with the 4v3 on the king side and the fact that you also have 2v1 on the queen side, there's just no hope for white. So we get knight d6. Magnus trades, goes rook d2, d7, a3, rook a7, h4, takes, and here we're in the end game. Magnus has two extra pawns. This is child's play. We get rook c3, rook d1, king h2, rook d6, rook c4, Magnus plays king g5, and in this position Erdogmus simply resigns. Main reason he resigns here is that what Magnus is going to do is he's eventually going to play e4, and he's going to do something very similar to the game against Hans. The king is always going to be cut off, so Magnus will eventually bring this, he'll play something like king d7, rook d5, and he'll start pushing the pawn using the king and the pawn. The rook cuts the king off of the file, and this will be a very straightforward victory. So that's why after king to g5, Erdogmus resigns this game. A very, very classic Magnus win. There was only one very serious mistake in this game from Erdogmus, but it was this fatal pawn to c4. The c4 not being quite explosive enough. And with this win, Magnus now takes a full 1-point lead going into the final round. Now, in the final round, Magnus would make a relatively quick draw with the white pieces against Anish Giri from the Netherlands. This means that Magnus wins the Rapid Championship once again. He won it in 2023. He did not win it last year in 2024, but he wins it again in 2025. And Magnus shows great class in some of these wins over the last couple of days. And he shows once again why he is the best player in the world. So what can I say? A phenomenal result from Magnus. Really puts it together on the final day when he needs to. He beats Serrano, he beats Hans, he beats Erdogmus. He wins the first 3 games. Just a spectacular performance. And there's really not much else that I can say other than it was a great performance and it was a joy to watch this event. So on that note, I'm going to call it for right now. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 3rd and final day of the World Rapid Chess Championship being held in Doha, Qatar. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with another recap after the Blitz starts tomorrow with day number 1. So really looking forward to it. We'll see if Ali Reza, who had a bad performance in the Rapid, can turn it around. Fabi, other players will maybe get into the mix, but that's going to do it for the Rapid tournament. Magnus shows great class, so I'm going to call it for right now. Hope you guys enjoyed this recap, and I'll see you guys tomorrow after I do a recap of the Blitz event. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and have a great rest of your day. See you soon. Bye.